Chapter 5. Joe's eyes flashed open, and he saw Nate dash ahead. Joe ran forward, darting between bales and slipping on the strewn hay. Balancing as he came to a stop, he looked up and saw his first target. It was far ahead, a little red flag on it. He drew back his bow and nocked his arrow. Joe exhaled slowly and fired, and the shaft sailed true, striking the scarlet center. He reached for a second arrow, gazing around as he did for the second and third targets. His hand closed on nothing. Joe wasn't carrying his quiver. Shooting a panicked glance over at Nate, he saw that his rival was nocking his second arrow. Nate had, of course, remembered to grab his quiver. As Joe sped back to retrieve his, he noticed Captain Fry and Lieutenant Dren smiling wryly, shaking their heads at him. He hurried back to the course. Dodging past some upturned carts and through a maze of bales, Joe rounded a turn to see his second target in the distance. As he readied his bow and slowly exhaled, setting his feet and closing one eye, the field between him and his target burst into flames. Captain Fry must have ordered pitch to be spread on the field and set ablaze just as Joe arrived. He dashed ahead, leaping through the flames, and landed on the far side. He steadied himself and shot, sending home a second shaft to the target's center circle. "I won't be stopped so easily, Captain." Joe felt a growing confidence as he hurried ahead. He darted past the target and scanned the field, now aflame and spewing smoke from many spots, for the last target, the upshot. Nate was 10 steps away, gazing all around in a concentrated frenzy. Both bucks were trying to locate the final target. Joe saw with a quick sideways glance that medics were helping an injured Kent off the course. It was down to Joe and Nate Flynn now, just what he had wanted for so long. Joe sprinted ahead, and Nate ran alongside him. They dodged through a final course of burning carts and bales, ducking under a crumbling arch as they advanced. When the two archers cleared the obstacles, they saw that soldiers with long shields were lined up on either side of them. There must have been 20 on each side. Joe looked from one side to the other, then dead ahead. He saw the target, set back at an incredible distance. Nate saw it too, and both bucks reached for arrows. Before either had an arrow nocked, rocks began raining down on them. Nate stood firm, nocking his arrow. He had nearly gotten his shot off when a rock struck his arm, sending his wayward arrow sailing into the sky. Joe fared no better, and his shot was wrecked when a rock snapped his shaft in half. Both archers regrouped quickly, Joe nocking another arrow as he danced sideways to try to get another shot off. He realized then that the target was so far away that it was unlikely he could hit its center, even if the rock barrage weren't happening. Now the flaming arrows came, darting back and forth across his field of vision, blurring the target and setting the field between them and it aflame. Smoke rose. It was nearly impossible to see the target. Nate rushed ahead, and Joe followed, the hail of rocks continuing. Finally, Nate spun and shot a quick succession of shots at the shields of the rock-hurling rabbits. Joe followed his example, and the two bucks advanced through the gauntlet, firing as they rushed onward. Joe aimed carefully at the shields, eager to stop the rocks without hurting the bucks behind them, though it didn't seem like they cared much whether he and Nate were hurt. Why were they being so careless with two valuable archers, especially the legendary Nate Flynn? This wasn't the war. But it soon will be. That's what Captain Fry knows. They sped on, dodging rocks as they continued to fire at the hurlers. Joe focused ahead, trying to peer through the smoke and flame to see the final target. "I only want a moment, one look at the target, and one moment to fire, just 1 second." The rocks stopped striking as Joe and Nate leapt through a series of blazing patches of grass. The target was in sight again. Each archer reached for fresh arrows, but they were rushed by 10 shield-bearing rabbits, who were on them in a moment. Joe tried to nock an arrow, but he was forced to sidestep the first opponent, then was clattered down by the second. He sprang up quickly, dodged again, and made it clear of the tackling band. A quick glance showed that Nate was still trapped by the horde. Joe's eyes widened, and he turned his gaze on the target as fresh fire sprang to life between him and it. Another hail of stones flew his way, along with the soldiers who hurled them. They would be on him in another instant, but he had found his moment. Joe quickly knocked his arrow and aimed, exhaling as he felt the pressure build around him. The shield-wielding bucks were nearly on him, and rocks rained all around. He saw the target and fixed on its center. He let go the arrow just before being smashed by a shield. He fell to the earth, never taking his eyes off the target as his arrow sailed on its way. He saw his arrow miss the center circle and stick just outside it, just before he crunched to the ground in the mud. Before he could find his feet again, Nate danced past him, on the run while attackers struggled to send him down again and rocks rained all around. Nate loosed an arrow, which sailed sweetly toward the target. Joe was on his knees, caked in mud, as Nate's speeding shaft broke through the target's center. A rock struck Joe's jaw, and he fell hard, his face making a furrow through the mud. When he looked up again, pain pulsing in his jaw, the crowd had rushed onto the course and were lifting Nate to their shoulders. Master Fletcher handed up the cup, and Nate thrust it into the air to exultant cheers. Joe sat on the ground as the crowd gathered around Nate, shouting his name.
"Shanks!"
a gruff voice said from behind. He turned to see Captain Fry glaring down at him, Lieutenant Drand beside him.
"When it really counts and there's something on the line, you choke. If you can't make the shot in battle conditions, then you're no soldier."
They stomped off, leaving Joe alone in the mud. Chapter 6. Lund led Joe back to his bunk, helped him get cleaned up, then left him to rest in silence. But Joe couldn't relax. He lay on his bunk and replayed the competition again and again, Captain Fry's words echoing in his ears.
"You're no soldier."
In a little while, Lund came back.
"They chose the units for the trip to the Citadel Congress at Cloud Mountain," he said.
Joe sat up, a last little spark of hope in his heart. This might be an opportunity for distinction. But Lund held up a hand.
"I'm afraid we weren't chosen. Several other units and bands are going, but not ours. We're on duty guarding Halfwind while the best are away with Lord Ramnor, Captain Fry, and the rest."
Joe sagged. "I can't believe I missed."
"Anyone would have missed that shot."
"Not him."
"No,"
Lund said, nodding.
"But anyone else. Anyway, get a little rest. You've had a tough day, and you're on sentry duty with me tonight at midnight."
"Isn't anyone else available?" Joe asked, smirking.
"I tried to get someone else," Lund said, returning the smirk, "but no one wanted to do it with you."
Joe tried to smile. "I'll see you then." Lund nodded and headed for the door.
"Oh, I almost forgot," he said, spinning back. "That votary, Sister Layla Looney, was looking for you."
"Don't call her that," Joe answered. "She's wonderful."
"If you say so," Lund said, palms up and shrugging. "Hey, maybe she'd go to the summer mingle with you." "Get out of here," Joe said, hurling a pillow at Lund, who ducked it and disappeared through the door. Lund was great at cheering him up, but the disappointment Joe felt at the failures of the day, as well as being left out of the adventure to Cloud Mountain, possibly the start of the war, was crushing. He realized that he hadn't had anything to eat since breakfast, and it was nearly sunset. He was weak, and even as sad as he felt, he still needed food. He stood up, walked to the door, and almost ran into a rabbit who was walking in. Nate Flynn. What's he doing here? Come to rub it in? "Joe Shanks," Nate said. "That's right, Nate," Joe answered, a little more curtly than he intended. "What can I do for you?" Nate seemed taken aback. "Well, I tried to find you on the field after the cup today. I wanted to congratulate you on your finish. You were incredible throughout the competition. I was really impressed." He extended a hand toward Joe. Joe took it, mouth open, but unable to say anything. "Anyway," Nate continued, "I have a proposition for you. That is, if you can stop sulking around like a baby." Joe's eyes shot open, and he found his voice. "I'm not," he began, but he stopped. He was sulking, it was true. "What do you propose?" he asked sourly. "That we go to the summer mingle?" "I thought of somewhere better," Nate said. "Cloud Mountain." Joe's eyes widened, and he looked up. "What do you mean?" he asked. "Kent got hurt in the final cup, and I need someone to replace him, even if it's just for a little while. He can't make the trip,
so I want you to stand in for Kent and go with us as one of the bracers." Joe just stared at Nate for a while. "Nate," he began. Then he looked down. "I don't deserve it. I missed the big shot. And anyway, I've been so wrong about you. I've always assumed that everything's been easy for you since you've been so successful. I haven't been fair to you. I'm sorry." "We're on the same side," Nate replied. "We're not rivals." "Not anymore. Thanks, Nate." "I'm Lieutenant Flynn now," he said, smiling. "I was made an officer, and the bracers have been folded into Captain Fry's company." "Yes, sir," Joe said, coming to attention. "We leave in an hour," Lieutenant Flynn said, then spun to head for the door. Over his shoulder he called, "And clean your sword." "Yes, sir," Joe called, smiling wide. Chapter 7. An hour later they were on the road to Cloud Mountain. Joe had had little rest and less food that day. They traveled through the night and reached their destination by morning, marching uphill as the rising sun sent long beams of light breaking through the mist. After Lord Ramner spoke to the hidden sentries in green garb, they passed into the fog-shrouded entrance to Cloud Mountain. In neat teams, under their assigned leaders, the selected half-wind soldiers crossed through a thin, trickling waterfall and into a long, cavernous passage, issuing at last into a small, clean cave set with tables and chairs. Beside it, beyond a wooden wall with an ornate door and a wide serving window, a large kitchen swarmed with workers. A stout rabbit wobbled around the kitchen, shaking his stirring spoon at a cadre of rabbits who cut vegetables, fed fires, and sweated over steaming pots of delicious-smelling concoctions. The squat chef harangued the workers between swiped bites of bread and hurried sips of soup. Lord Ramner rushed through another door while their guide, a tall lieutenant named Pacer, introduced them to the cook.
"You're welcome here at the Savory Den," the cook said, motioning for them to crowd in. "I'm Gort, the proprietor of this establishment. I believe half of you are set to make camp, while the other half sit to breakfast. If those prepared to dine would take their seats, I'll have you all served in a moment. I hope you approve of our preparations."
Captain Fry gruffly thanked Gort, then led the half-set toward their camp through another door, while Lieutenant Cout oversaw the remaining half. The food was brought out, and Joe devoured his quickly. When he brought his bowl to the large window, he was met by Gort.
"Would you like more, lad?"
Gort asked. "I would love more, sir," Joe answered. Gort reached inside the window and motioned for a portion of the simmering soup to be ladled into Joe's bowl. Joe thanked him, turned to hurry back to his seat, and collided with Lieutenant Drand. His soup sloshed over the lip of his bowl and sprayed Drand across his chest. The soup dripped down onto the floor as Joe's eyes widened. "Lieutenant, I'm so sorry."
"Just get out of the way, Shanks,"
Drand said, his face pinched in disgust.
"What are you even doing here? You weren't selected."
"I've replaced Kent Howman in the bracers, sir," Joe answered.
"Then I'll need to have a word with Nate," Drand said, stomping toward the kitchen.
Joe turned to ask for something to wipe up the mess he'd made, but Gort came beside him and motioned him back to his seat.
"Don't worry about that, lad,"
the stout proprietor said.
"No harm will come of a little spilled soup. Just you eat what you have, and I'll bring you more."
In a few minutes, Gort, true to his word, brought Joe another bowl of soup and some extra bread. The other bracers looked on with envious expressions. "Thank you, sir," Joe said. "This is really wonderful."
"I'm honored you think so,"
Gort said, passing his hand over his mouth to hide his wide smile.
"You bolt that soup like you've never eaten before."
"I haven't ever eaten anything like this, that's for sure. It's true, I've missed a few meals, but I think I'd ask for more of this no matter how full I was."
"Well,"
Gort said, beaming down on Joe,
"you need never go hungry here. Come to the Savory Den at any hour and we'll be sure you're fed, lad."
Joe smiled and thanked him, while behind Gort, a door swung open, and a rabbit bearing 7 trays, each level stacked with a bevy of mugs, stumbled inside. The mugs were lovely, an elegant mix of ornate and sturdy, with rabbit-eared handles and shining glaze, but the precarious way they slid from side to side as the bearer overcompensated back and forth made Joe think they were all doomed to tumble at any moment. Joe half stood, looking around as others did the same. The top trays slid to the right, while a jerk back by the bearer sent the bottom trays shifting leftward. The stacked trays of mugs began to make an S shape, and the watching soldiers inhaled sharply. The bearer seemed unconcerned, even smiling, while waving and exchanging a few words with the diners nearest the door. Gort heard the groans and saw the concern on Joe's face. He turned his head with some difficulty to see what had distracted Joe from his delicious food. He gasped.
"Not again, Ephah Potter!"
Gort cried, huffing as he frantically began to waddle over. Joe stood, wincing as the trays lurched farther back and forth and seemed certain to tumble at any moment.
"Master Ephah, hold still!"
Gort cried, picking up surprising speed as he tottered back and forth in a wobbly sprint toward the clueless Potter. Just as Gort gained maximum speed, he slipped on the spilled soup and pitched backward, sliding into Ephah Potter's thin legs. The Potter fell forward and threw up his arms, sending the 7 trays of mugs sailing into the air. Joe winced as the beautiful mugs fell amid a bedlam of desperate diving efforts to save some. The mugs crashed down, shattering in fantastic shards, amid the din of anguished cries from Gort, Ephah, and the watching soldiers. When it was over, and silence fell again on the savory den, Gort sat amid the ruins of the 7 trays of mugs, holding, in each hand, a saved mug. Ephah Potter, his wide face stuck in a stunned expression, held 2 mug handles. The mugs themselves were shattered to bits. Master Ephah recovered from his stupor, stared around at the sea of shattered pottery, and frowned. He laid his 2 mug handles down, slowly and carefully for some reason, then gazed up at Gort's hands. The last 2 mugs of the batch. Joe smiled as he saw the relief on the old Potter's face at seeing 2 saved mugs.
"Well done, Gort,"
Ephah Potter said, slapping his friend so hard on the back that the mugs were jostled free of the harried cook's grasp and fell to the ground to shatter amid the horrified gasps of all present. Gort's face seemed stuck between fury and sadness, and his left eye twitched as he rounded on Ephah Potter.
"You!"
he began, but he choked on the words.
"Well,"
Ephah Potter said, carefully getting to his feet and waving self-consciously at the astonished diners.
"Looks like I'd better get back to the wheel. Don't worry, Gort, I won't charge you for these, and I'll send my apprentices to clean this up."
Gort's eyes seemed to be bulging out of his head. He sputtered, but still could not find the words.
"Okay, then,"
Ephah went on, backing up slowly and picking his way carefully through the far-flung mess.
"I'll just be heading back to work. Back to work."
Joe finished his meal while the staff, unwilling to allow the soldiers to help, cleaned up the aftermath of Gort's bowling down the odd Potter. Joe was tired, and when they made their way through the secret door, down the long passage and up the high stairs, he felt sleep overtaking him. He stumbled through a beautiful sunlit garden that stood out beside a wood-walled building, and walked past a statue of 2 heroic rabbits, then through another door and down another long passage. Joe struggled to keep his eyes open as they passed through what Nate, who marched just ahead of him, called Hallway Round. Next, they passed through a door that stood beside 2 large blast powder kegs and walked out onto a green beside a large garden on their right. They walked through the green, seeing several rabbits working in the garden and others heading toward Hallway Round, bearing all manner of tools for their various trades. In the distance, Joe saw a neat village of cottages, and beyond them, a rocky outcropping that seemed to circle, and jagged peaks and dips, the edges of this mountaintop. On the far side of the green, he saw a tree thick with dangling ropes, and all sorts of strange constructions attached to the ropes and set on the grass. Amid the mess, a tall black rabbit and a smaller gold-gray buck were fighting with wooden swords. He heard the smack of their parried blows and watched them as he walked on, following Nate along with the rest of the archers. Joe was no expert with a sword, but he saw that they were both very good, especially the master. "Who is that, Lieutenant Flynn?" Joe asked.
"I don't know," Nate answered, "but I wouldn't want to fight the black one."
As they watched, the black rabbit rose and kicked the sword free from his student. Joe thought that the contest would be over, but it wasn't. The black buck ran at the younger, chasing him around, striking him with his wooden sword while the younger dodged and tried to dart away. Finally, the student turned and leapt into a kick. The older buck stepped sideways and drove his shoulder into the younger buck, sending him sprawling. When he was on the ground, the black rabbit kicked dirt in his eyes and then leapt on him, striking him again and again. Joe saw a white doe emerge from the hallway round door and walk slowly toward the tree. She stopped, while still a long way off, and watched the battling bucks, a concerned expression on her face. "Who's that?" Joe asked. "She's beautiful." "I still don't know anyone here," Nate answered, shaking his head. But he stopped and gazed at the doe as a surly-faced soldier from Blackstone passed them, heading the other way. "That's Heather," the soldier said, scowling. "Heather Longtreader. They're all traitors if you ask me." He shook his head and moved on. Joe's expression changed in a moment. "The lovely traitor," he said, eyes thinning to slits. "What a shame." "Let's go," Nate said, and they hurried to catch up with the rest. Joe's company reached the caves beyond the village, and they followed Lieutenant Cout into an opening in the rock. They carried on through the tunnel until it issued onto a large plateau. The area was lined with catapults and held many camps of soldiers from various citadels. Joe recognized the divided shield crest of Kingston. One side bore a circle of 9 red diamonds surrounding one large green one in the center, and the other side a simple black star. He also saw soldiers from Harbone and Blackstone, Vandalia, and others spread out over the plateau. Looking right, however, he saw there was one area the camping soldiers kept clear of. There were 7 standing stones near the edge, and a few old votaries kneeling at the base of the 7th. Joe looked up to the top of the 7th stone and saw a solitary rabbit, silhouetted against the sky. He seemed to be gazing into the distance. Joe followed his line of vision and saw nothing but the drifting fog, but Joe knew what lay beyond the mist. The Great Wood. First Warren. Occupied territory. Joe looked up at the lone rabbit once again, and then Nate called for him to catch up, so he jogged ahead to make camp with the bracers in the area Captain Fry had designated for them. The old captain was leading his half of the weary bucks back toward the savory den and their long-awaited meal. "We muster and train at the evening bell," Nate told the small band of archers. "I don't intend to waste our days here being idle. After our company muster and drills, we'll do more on our own. Any questions?" "Nate," Junder began, then corrected himself. "Sorry, Lieutenant Flynn. When does the Congress begin? And when are they going to put those Longtreader traitors on trial?" "I don't know either answer, Junder," Nate replied. "I only know that we want to be ready when there's trouble, inside or outside this place." "Should we have a class on keeping our swords clean?" Owen, a tall white rabbit with red eyes, asked. They all snickered, and Joe rolled his eyes. "Set up your tents," Nate said, and they all went to work. Joe and Nate set up their tent. They would share one, since Kent had always roomed with their leader, and, for now, Joe was taking his place. When the work was done, Nate ordered them all to get some sleep. Joe didn't need to be told twice. For the second time in 2 days, he fell asleep with his sword buckled on. Chapter 8. Joe woke, bolting upright at a noise outside his tent. Loud shouting and the clash of steel. Battle sounds. Hurried footsteps signaled an urgent approach. He stood up in the small space and ripped free his sword as the tent flap opened and Nate's head poked in. Nate immediately drew back, an alarmed expression on his face. "What are you doing, Shanks?" he cried. Now Joe could tell that the sounds outside were simple drills, being carried out energetically, probably by another citadel's soldiers. Joe began, searching for an excuse as to why he had nearly taken off the head of his commanding officer. He spied a rag hanging from the tent's support and brought it down smoothly across his blade. "I'm just wiping down my sword, sir. Getting it, just very, very clean, sir." Nate frowned at him, then shook his head. "Listen, Joe," he said, slipping into the tent. "Captain Fry has already cautioned me for bringing you along. He doesn't think you're ready, that you have what it takes. So my first official interaction with the highest officer in our citadel, after becoming an officer, was listening to him express his intense displeasure at my first ever decision as an officer. I'm sorry, Joe said.
Don't be sorry, Nate replied. Be good. Be worthy of my trust. Be the best.
How can I be the best when you're here?
I keep telling you, Shanks, Nate said, reaching for the flap, that we're on the same side. Harbone has the field now. Our muster's in an hour.
He disappeared and closed the tent flap. Joe took a deep breath and let out a groan. Great start, he said aloud. Then he proceeded to actually clean his sword. When he was done, he believed it was cleaner than any sword ever presented at any muster. He knew this virtually guaranteed it would not be examined, but it had to be done. Joe saw to his bow and quiver, straightened his uniform, then split the tent flap and walked out into a gorgeous evening on the plateau. The sun was descending amid a carnival of color, pink and purple, and every shade between, swirling in vibrant patterns that glowed in the misty sky. Joe breathed in the evening air and then walked toward the towering stones. 7 of them stretched high into the sky to honor the heritage of their ancient ancestors, Flint and Fay, and all of the Leapers. Joe was a devout rabbit, and he considered joining the brother votaries ever since he was young. But when his father had died in debt, passing on to his son his own worst fears of failure and ruin, Joe had dedicated himself to a military life. Joe's stroll took him past the open area where Harbone's soldiers were training, and to the foot of the 7th standing stone. He knelt and touched his ears, eyes, and then his mouth. He rose and began to ascend the stairs, always looking up and off at the enchanting sky. As he neared the top, still distracted by the beautiful view, he ran into a rabbit, starting to descend. "I'm sorry," Joe said, reaching out to be sure neither of them fell. "I was distracted." "Me too, friend," the other answered. He was a short white rabbit, young and very strong. Joe could feel the strength of his grip as they helped each other, stepping back to safety. "I think I saw you here this morning when we arrived," Joe said. "Are you considering the contemplative life?" "It was me," the other rabbit answered. "Though you're far easier to see than I am, as tall as you are. I've always been, well, a bit closer to the ground. I come up here most mornings and evenings when I can. It helps me feel connected to the past, and," he said, motioning vaguely toward the great wood in the distance, "the future." "I'm Joe Shanks," Joe said. "I'm Smalls," the white rabbit answered. Joe noticed there was no citadel symbol on the short rabbit's chest or shoulder. "Have you been here long?" he asked. "I haven't been anywhere long," Smalls sighed, looking out over the rolling mountains of the wide forest far ahead. "How about you, Joe? Halfwind? Is that your home? Or are you just stationed there?" "I'm from Halfwind," Joe answered, slowly settling down to sit atop the standing stone. "At least that's where I've been ever since I can remember. Father brought me up there, but he didn't live too many years after the king fell." Smalls sat beside Joe and nodded, a pained expression on his face. "I'm sorry about your family, Joe. So many of us are orphans now. What kind of buck was your father?" "He was a mason, but he wanted to be an archer. He'd been an archer in the old army and was a crack shot, but his foot was crushed in an accident, and he was dismissed from the service at Halfwind. Captain Fry sent him away, told him he'd have to find another path. So he became a mason, but he wasn't very good with his pay and he made some bad decisions. Really, his friends said he was never the same after Mother was killed in the after-terrors. Father suffered intensely from losing her, and he was always angry about those who betrayed the king. He became he was not at his finest as I grew up. He died very disappointed in himself and deep in debt. I'm sorry for that. It must have been hard." "It was that. Debt and dishonor are a heavy burden for any buck to bear, young or old. But your father's debts and any disgrace need not fall on you," Smalls said. Joe looked down. "It's easy to say that when it isn't your own family's story." "I understand. So, how will you come out of it, Joe? You don't seem the type to settle for dishonor." "No, Smalls, I won't," Joe said. "I've told almost no one this, but I paid Father's debts." "Even though you had no obligation?" "No legal obligation." "I see. And I've tried ever since to pursue honor and distinction in the field my father dreamed of. I'm an archer." "You must be doing well, Joe." I know the citadels have only brought their finest to this Congress, so you must be well thought of at Half-Wind. Congratulations." "I'm not so well thought of as you might think," Joe said, glancing back at the tents behind and below them, "but I aim to change that." "I hope you gain all you aim for and strike the target in its middlemost heart," Smalls said. Joe felt this genuine well-wishing like a blessing. He had no idea why he had so honestly opened up to this stranger. Smalls was young, yes, but when Joe looked into his eyes, he saw a deep well. Joe had told him so much in such a short time, even about paying father's debts. Would he next share how he gave the sisters the portion he used to set aside to pay debts? Would he tell this rabbit his deepest secrets? Joe knew that, for courtesy and to protect himself, he must turn the conversation back. "What about your father, Smalls?" "Died as well," Smalls answered. Joe waited for him to elaborate, but he only stared off into the distance, a look of inconsolable longing on his face. "What's your course now, Smalls? Find a calling here? A wife?" Joe asked. Smalls looked down, grimacing as he did. "There is a doe," Joe said, smiling at Smalls. "I can tell. There's a doe you have in mind." Smalls nodded, then let out a short laugh. "There's always hope," he said. "As for my calling, I'm a soldier and a scout, eager to take the war to Morbin, just like everyone else. I don't know what will happen to me, but I know what I have to do." Joe nodded. "May your feet find the next stone." "And you, brother," Smalls said, touching his ears, eyes, then mouth. Just then, the evening bell rang out.